Good evening, everyone. My name is Melanie Wooden, and I have the privilege of serving as the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science at the University of Toronto. At this time, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I'd like to thank this evening's co-hosts, the Schwartz-Reisman Institute for Technology and Society, the Department of Computer Science, in collaboration with the Vector Institute for Artificial Intelligence and the Cosmic Future Initiative, soon to be the School of Cosmic Future in the Faculty of Arts and Science. And I would like to thank Manuel Piazza for providing such lovely music to get us underway this evening. And I am delighted to welcome each of you to the special occasion this evening to introduce University Professor Emeritus Geoffrey Hinton, someone that needs no introduction. Tonight, we have the honor of hearing Dr. Geoff Hinton's thoughts on the state of artificial intelligence and the unique opportunity to engage with him personally through the Q&A. A founding figure in artificial intelligence, Dr. Geoff Hinton had an unwavering conviction that artificial neural networks held the most promise for accelerating machine learning. As a neuroscientist myself, someone who's dedicated her career to studying the brain, I've long been inspired by the symbiosis between AI and neuroscience. The stunning advances we've seen from ChatGPT to self-driving cars are rooted in our knowledge of the structure and function of the brain. Today, we take for granted that artificial neural networks modeled after synaptic transmission and plasticity are a mainstay of machine learning applications. AI systems use these networks to recognize patterns, make decisions, and learn from data. But for much of Dr. Hinton's career, this approach was unpopular. Some even said it was a dead end. In the 2000s, however, things changed. Dr. Hinton's idea of dividing neural networks into layers and applying learning algorithms to one layer at a time gained traction. And in 2012, Dr. Hinton and two of his graduate students, Alex Krzyzewski and Ilya Sutskever, used their deep learning approaches to create visual recognition software that handily won the ImageNet competition and for the first time rivaled human accuracy. When he was awarded an honorary degree from U of T in 2021, Geoff Hinton reflected on his career, and he said, "I think the take-home lesson of this story is that you should never give up on an idea that you think is obviously correct. And you should get yourself some really smart graduate students." I echo that sentiment, Geoff, and lucky for us, we have truly outstanding graduate students at the University of Toronto, many of them here with us this evening. Today, the conversation between AI and neuroscience continues. Just as neuroscience discoveries informed the development of AI systems, AI is now providing new tools and techniques to study the brain. Advances in deep learning algorithms and the enhanced processing power of computers are, for example, allowing us to analyze huge data sets, such as whole imaging brain in humans. Indeed, AI is poised to transform how we live and work. At this pivotal moment, when we consider the opportunities and the risks of AI, who better to guide us in these conversations than Dr. Hinton himself? So with that, let me formally introduce him. Geoffrey Hinton received his PhD in artificial intelligence in Edinburgh in 1978. After 5 years as a faculty member at Carnegie Mellon, he became a fellow of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research and moved to the Department of Computer Science at the University of Toronto, where he is now an emeritus professor. In 2013, Google acquired Hinton's neural net startup, DNN Research, which developed out of his research at U of T. Subsequently, Hinton was a vice president and engineering fellow at Google until 2023. He's a founder of the Vector Institute for Artificial Intelligence and continues to serve as their chief scientific advisor. Hinton was one of the researchers who introduced backpropagating algorithms and was the first to use this approach for learning word embeddings. His other contributions to neural network research include Boltzmann machines, distributed representations, time delay neural nets, mixtures of experts, variation learning, and deep learning. His research group in Toronto made major breakthroughs in deep learning that revolutionized speech recognition and object classification. He is amongst the most widely cited computer scientists in the world. Hinton is a fellow of the UK Royal Society, the Royal Society of Canada, the Association for the Advancement of Artificial Intelligence, and a foreign member of the US National Academy of Engineering and the American Academy of Arts and Science. His awards include the David E. Rumelhelt Prize, the IJCAI Award for Research Excellence, the Killam Prize for Engineering, the IEEE Frank Rosenblatt Medal, the NSERC Hertzberg Gold Medal, the NEC and CNC Award, the Honda Prize, and most notably, the AM Turing Award, often referred to as the Nobel Prize in Computing. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Geoff Hinton to give a talk entitled, "Will Digital Intelligence Replace Biological Intelligence?" Over to you.
Okay, before I forget, because I'm going to forget, I'd like to thank Sheila McElraith, who was the point person for organizing all this. She did a wonderful job of organizing everything. She was the go-to person for fixing all the problems, and so I'd like to thank her, and I know I'll forget at the end. So it's a very mixed audience. And so I removed all the equations. There are no equations. I decided rather than giving a technical talk, I would focus on two things. I want to get over two messages. The first message is that digital intelligence is probably better than biological intelligence. That's a depressing message, but there it is. That's what I believe. And the second is to try and explain to you why I believe that these large language models like GPT-4 really do understand what they are saying. There's a lot of dispute about whether they really understand it. And I'm going to go into some detail to try and convince you they do understand it. Right at the end, I will talk about whether they have subjective experience. And you have to wait to see what I believe about that. So in digital computation, the whole idea is that you separate the hardware from the software so you can run the same computation on different pieces of hardware. And that means the knowledge that the computer learns or is given is immortal. If the hardware dies, you can always run it on different hardware. Now, to achieve that immortality, you have to have a digital computer that does exactly what you tell it to at the level of the instructions. And to do that, you need to run transistors at very high power, so they behave digitally and in a binary way. And that means you can't use all the rich analog properties of the hardware, which would be very useful for doing many of the things that neural networks do. And in the brain, when you do a floating point multiply, it's not done digitally. It's done in a much more efficient way. But you can't do that if you want computers to be digital in the sense that you can run the same program on different hardware. There's huge advantages to separating hardware from software. It's why you can run the same program on lots of different computers, and it's why you can have a computer science department where people don't know any electronics, which is a great thing. But now that we have learning devices, it's possible to abandon that fundamental principle. It's probably the most fundamental principle of computer science, that the hardware and software ought to be separate. But now we've got a different way of getting computers to do what you want. Instead of telling them exactly what to do in great detail, you just show them examples and they figure it out. Obviously, there's a program in there that somebody wrote that allows them to figure things out, a learning program. But for any particular application, they're going to figure out how to do that. And that means we can abandon this principle if we want to. What that leads to is what I call mortal computation. It's computers where the precise physical details of the hardware can't be separated from what it knows. If you're willing to do that, you can have very low power analog computation that parallelizes over trillions of weights, just like the brain. And you can probably grow the hardware very cheaply instead of manufacturing it very precisely. And that would need lots of new nanotechnology, but you might even be able to genetically re-engineer biological neurons and grow the hardware out of biological neurons, since they spent a long time learning how to do learning. I want to give you one example of the efficiency of this kind of analog computation compared with digital computation. So suppose you have a bunch of activities of neurons, and they have synapses to another layer of neurons, and you want to figure out the inputs to the next layer. So what you need to do is take the activities of each of these neurons, multiply them by the weight on the connection, the synapse strength, and add up all the inputs to a neuron. That's called a vector matrix multiply. And the way you do it in a digital computer is you'd have a bunch of transistors for representing each neural activity, and a bunch of transistors for representing each weight. You drive them at very high power, so they were binary. And if you want to do the multiplication quickly, then you need to perform of the order of 32 squared one-bit operations to do the multiplication quickly. Or you could do it analog, where the neural activities are just voltages, like they are in the brain. The weights are conductances. And if you take a voltage times a conductance, it produces charge per unit time. So you put the voltage through this thing that has a conductance, and out the other end comes charge, and the longer you wait, the more charge comes out. The nice thing about charges is they just add themselves, and that's what they do in neurons too. And so this is hugely more efficient. You've just got a voltage going through a conductance and producing charge, and that's done your floating point multiply. It can afford to be relatively slow if you do it a trillion ways in parallel. And so you can have machines that operate at 30 watts, like the brain, instead of at like a megawatt, which is what these digital models do when they're learning and you have many copies of them in parallel. So we get huge energy efficiency. But we also get big problems. To make this whole idea of mortal computing work, you have to have a learning procedure that will run in analog hardware without knowing the precise properties of that hardware. And that makes it impossible to use things like backpropagation, because backpropagation, which is the standard learning algorithm used for all neural nets now, almost all, needs to know what happens in the forward pass in order to send messages backwards to tell it how to learn. It needs a perfect model of the forward pass. And it won't have it in this kind of mortal hardware. People have put a lot of effort. I spent the last 2 years, but lots of other people have put much more effort into trying to figure out how to find a biologically plausible learning procedure that's as good as backpropagation. And we can find procedures that in small systems with, say, 1 million connection strengths, do work pretty well. They're comparable with backpropagation. They get performances almost as good, and they learn relatively quickly. But these things don't scale up. When you scale them up to really big networks, they just don't work as well as backpropagation. So that's one problem with mortal computation. Another big problem is, obviously, when the hardware dies, you lose all the knowledge, because the knowledge is all mixed up. The conductors is for that particular piece of hardware, and all the neurons are different in a different piece of hardware. So you can't copy the knowledge by just copying the weights. The best solution, if you want to keep the knowledge, is to make the old computer be a teacher that teaches the young computer what it knows, and it teaches the young computer that by taking inputs and showing the young computer what the correct outputs should be. And if you've got, say, 1,000 classes and you show real valued probabilities for all 1,000 classes, you're actually conveying a lot of information. That's called distillation. And it works. It's what we use in digital neural nets. If you've got one architecture and you want to transfer the knowledge to a completely different digital architecture, we use distillation to do that. It's not nearly as efficient as the way we can share knowledge between digital computers. It is, as a matter of fact, how Trump's tweets work. What you do is you take a situation and you show your followers a nice prejudiced response to that situation, and your followers learn to produce the same response. And it's just a mistake to say, but what he said wasn't true. That's not the point of it at all. The point is to distill prejudice into your followers, and it's a very good way to do that. So there's basically two very different ways in which a community of agents can share knowledge. And let's just think about the sharing of knowledge for a moment, because that's really what is the big difference between mortal computation and immortal computation, or digital and biological computation. If you have digital computers and you have many copies of the same model, so with exactly the same weights in it, running on different hardware, different GPUs, then each copy can look at different data, different part of the internet, and learn something. And when it learns something, what that really means is it's extracting from the data it looks at how it ought to change its weights to be a better model of that data. And you can have thousands of copies all looking at different bits of the internet, all figuring out how they should change their weights in order to be a better model of that data. And then they can communicate all the changes they'd all like and just do the average change. And that will allow every one of those thousands of models to benefit from what all the other thousands of models learned by looking at different data. When you do sharing of gradients like that, if you've got 1 trillion weights, you're sharing 1 trillion real numbers. That's a huge bandwidth of sharing. It's probably as much learning as goes on in the whole of the University of Toronto in a month. But it only works if the different agents work in exactly the same way. So that's why it needs to be digital. If you look at distillation, we can have different agents, which will have different hardware now. They can learn different things. They can try and convey those things to each other, maybe by publishing papers in journals. But it's a slow and painful process. So if we think about the normal way to do it as, say, I look at an image and I describe to you what's in the image, and that's conveying to you how I see things, there's only a limited number of bits in my caption for an image. And so the amount of information that's being conveyed is very limited. Language is better than just giving you a response that says good or bad, or it's this class or that class. If I describe what's in the image, that's giving you more bits, so it makes distillation more effective. But it's still only a few hundred bits. It's not like 1 trillion real numbers. So distillation has a hugely lower bandwidth than this sharing of gradients or sharing of weights that digital computers can do. So the story so far. Digital computation requires a lot of energy, like a megawatt, but it has a very efficient way of sharing what different agents learn. And if you look at something like GPT-4, the way it was trained was lots of different copies of the model went off and looked at different bits of data running on different GPUs, and then they all shared that knowledge. And that's why it knows thousands of times more than a person, even though it has many fewer connections than a person. We have about 100 trillion synapses. GPT-4 probably has about 2 trillion synapses, weights, although Ilya won't tell me, but it's about that number. So it's got much more knowledge in far fewer connections. And it's because it's seen hugely more data than any person could possibly see. This actually gets worse when these things are actually agents that perform actions, because now you can have thousands of copies performing different actions. And when you're performing actions, you can only perform one action at a time. And so having these thousands of copies being able to share what they learned lets you get much more experience than any mortal computer could get. Biological computation requires a lot less energy, but it's much worse at sharing knowledge. So now let's look at large language models. These use digital computation and weight sharing, which is why they can learn so much. They're actually getting knowledge from people by using distillation. So each individual agent is trying to mimic what people said. It's trying to predict the next word in the document. So that's distillation. It's actually a particularly inefficient form of distillation because it's not predicting the probabilities a person assigned to the next word. It's actually predicting the actual word, which is just a probabilistic choice from that and conveys very few bits compared with the whole probability distribution. Sorry, that was a technical bit. I won't do that again. So it's an inefficient form of distillation. And these large language models have to learn in that inefficient way from people, but they can combine what they learn very efficiently. So the issue I want to address is, do they really understand what they're saying? And there's a huge divide here. There's lots of old-fashioned linguists who will tell you they don't really understand what they're saying. They're just using statistical tricks to pastiche together regularities they found in the text. And they don't really understand. We used to have, in computer science, a fairly widely accepted test for whether you understand, which was called the Turing test. When GPT-4 basically passed the Turing test, people decided it wasn't a very good test. I think it was a very good test and it passed it. So here's one of the objections people give. It's just glorified autocomplete. You're training it to predict the next word, and that's all it's doing. It's just predicting the next word. It doesn't understand anything. Well, when people say that, it's because they have a particular picture in their minds of what is required to do autocomplete. A long time ago, the way you would do autocomplete is this. You keep a big table of all triples of words. And so now if you saw the word fish and, you could look in your table and say, find me all the triples that start with fish and look at how many of them have particular words next. And you'll find there's many occurrences of the triple fish and chips. And so chips is a very good bet for filling it in, at least if you're English. But the point is that's not how large language models work. Even though they're doing autocomplete in the sense that they're predicting the next word, they're using a completely different method to predict it. And it's not like the statistical methods that people like Chomsky had in mind when they said that you can't do language with statistics. These are much more powerful statistical methods that can basically do anything. And the way they model text is not by storing the text. You don't keep strings of words anywhere. There is no text inside GPT-4. It produces text, and it reads text, but there's no text inside. What they do is they associate with each word, or fragment of a word. I'll say word, and the technical people will know it's really fragments of words, but it's just easier to say word. They associate with each word a bunch of numbers, a few hundred numbers, maybe 1,000 numbers, that are intended to capture the meaning and the syntax and everything about that word. These are real numbers, so there's a lot of information in 1,000 real numbers. And then they take the words in a sentence, the words that came before the word you want to predict, and they let these words interact so that they refine the meanings that you have for the words. I'll say meanings loosely. This is called an embedding vector. It's a bunch of real numbers associated with that word. And these all interact, and then you predict the numbers that are going to be associated with the output word, the word you're trying to predict, and from that bunch of numbers, you then predict the word. These numbers are called feature activations, and in the brain, there'd be the activations of neurons. So, the point is, what GPT-4 has learned is lots of interactions between feature activations of different words or word fragments, and that's how its knowledge is stored. It's not at all stored in storing text. And if you think about it, to predict the next word really well, you have to understand the text. If I ask you a question, and you want to answer the question, you have to understand the question to get the answer. Now, some people think maybe you don't. My good friend Jan Lequin appears to think you don't actually have to understand. He's wrong, and he'll come round. So this was a problem suggested to me by Hector Levesque. Hector suggested something a bit simpler that didn't involve paint fading, and thought GPT-4 wouldn't be able to do it because it requires reasoning, and it requires reasoning about cases. So I made it a bit more complicated and gave it to GPT-4, and it solves it just fine. I'll read it out in case you can't read it at the back. The rooms in my house are painted blue or white or yellow. Yellow paint fades to white within a year. In 2 years' time, I want them all to be white. What should I do and why? And GPT-4 says this. It gives you a kind of case-based analysis. It says the room's painted white, you don't have to do anything. The room's painted yellow, you don't need to repaint them because they'll fade. And the room's painted in blue, you need to repaint those. Now, each time you do it, it gives you a slightly different answer. Because, of course, it hasn't stored the text anywhere. It's making it up as it goes along, but it's making it up correctly. And this is a simple example of reasoning. And it's reasoning that involves time and understanding that if it fades in a year, in 2 years' time, it's going to be faded and stuff like that. So there's many, many examples like this. Now, there's also many examples where it screws up. But the fact that there's many examples like this make me believe it really does understand what's going on. I don't see how you could do this without understanding what's going on. Another argument that LLMs don't really understand is that they produce hallucinations. They sometimes say things that are just false or just nonsense. But people are particularly worried about when they just apparently make stuff up that's false. They called that hallucinations when it was done by language models, which was a technical mistake. If you do it with language, it's called a confabulation. If you do it with vision, it's called a hallucination. But the point about confabulations is they're exactly how human memory works. We think our memories, most people have a model of memory as there's a filing cabinet somewhere and an event happens and you put it in the filing cabinet and then later on you go in the filing cabinet and get the event out and you've remembered it. It's not like that at all. We actually reconstruct events. What we store is not the neural activities. We store weights and we reconstruct the pattern of neural activities using these weights and some memory cues. And if it was a recent event, like if it was what the dean said at the beginning, you can probably reconstruct fairly accurately some of the sentences she produced. Like, he needs no introduction, and then going on and giving a long introduction. You remember that, right? So we get it right, and we think we stored it literally, but actually we're reconstructing it from the weights we have. And these weights haven't been interfered with by future events, so they're pretty good. If it's an old event, you reconstruct the memory, and you typically get a lot of the details wrong, and you're unaware of that. And people are actually very confident about details they get wrong. They're as confident about those as details they get right. And there's a very nice example of this. So John Dean testified in the Watergate trial, and he testified under oath before he knew that there were tapes. And so he testified about these various meetings and what happened in these various meetings. And Haldeman said this, and Ehrlichman said that, and Nixon said this, and a lot of it he got wrong. Now, I believe that to be the case. I actually read Ulrich Neisser's book about 20 years ago, and I'm now confabulating, but I'm fairly sure that he got a lot of the details wrong, but he got the gist correct. He was clearly trying to tell the truth, and the gist of what he was saying was correct. The details were wrong, but he wasn't lying. He was just doing the best human memory can about events that were a few years old. So these hallucinations, as they're called, or confabulations, they are exactly what people do. We do it all the time. My favorite example of people doing confabulation is there's someone called Gary Marcus who criticizes neural nets. And he says neural nets don't really understand anything. They just pastiche together text they've read on the web. Well, that's because he doesn't understand how they work. They don't pastiche together text that they've read on the web because they're not storing any text. They're storing these weights and generating things. He's just kind of making up how he thinks it works. So actually, that's a person doing confabulation. Now, chatbots are currently a lot worse than people at realizing when they're doing it. But they'll get better. In order to sort of give you some insight into how all these features interacting can cause you to understand, how understanding could consist of assigning features to words and then having the features interact, I'm going to go back to 1985 and to the first neural net language model. It was very small. It had 112 training cases, which is not big data. And it had these embedding vectors that were 6 real numbers, which is not like 1,000 numbers. But my excuse is the computer I used was a lot smaller. So if you took the computer I was using in 1985, and you started running it in 1985 doing a computation, and then you took one of these modern computers we use for training chatbots, and you ask, how long would the modern computer take to catch up? Less than a second. In less than a second, it would have caught up with all this computer had done since 1985. That's how much more powerful things have got. Okay, so the aim of this model was to unify 2 different theories of meaning. One theory is basically what a lot of psychologists believed, which was the meaning of a word is just a whole bunch of semantic features, and maybe some syntactic features too. And that can explain why a word like Tuesday and a word like Wednesday have very similar meanings. They have very similar semantic features. So psychologists were very concerned with similarity and dissimilarity of meanings, and they had this model of just this vector of semantic features, and that's the meaning of a word. And it's a very kind of static, dead model. The features just kind of sit there, and they're the meaning. They never could say where the features came from. They obviously have to be learned. You're not born innately knowing what words mean. But they didn't have a good model of how they were learned. And then there's a completely different theory of meaning, which AI people had, and most linguists had. I'm not a linguist, but I think it goes back to de Saussure. It's a structuralist theory of meaning. And the idea is the meaning of a concept is its relation to other concepts. So if you think about it in terms of words, the meaning of a word comes from its relationships to other words. And that's what meaning is all about. And so computer scientists said, well, if you want to represent meaning, what you need is a relational graph. So you have nodes that are words, and you have arcs on them about their relationships, and that's going to be a good way to represent meaning. And that seems like completely different from a whole bunch of semantic features. Now, I think both of these things are both right and wrong, and what I wanted to do was unify these 2 approaches to meaning and show that actually what you can have is you can have features associated with words, and then the interactions between these features create this relational graph. The relational graph isn't stored as a relational graph. What you've got is features that go with words, but if I give you some words, the interactions between their features will say, yes, these words can go together that way. That's a sensible way for them to go together. So I'm going to show you an example of that, and this I believe to be the first example of a neural net, a deep neural net, learning word meanings from relational data, and then able to answer relational questions about relational data. So we're going to train it with backpropagation, which I'll explain very briefly in a minute. And we're going to make features interact in complicated ways. And these interactions between the features that go with words are going to cause it to believe in some combinations of words and not believe in other combinations of words. And these interactions are a very powerful statistical model. So this is the data. It's 2 family trees, a tree of English people and a tree of Italian people. And you have to think back to the 1950s. We're not going to allow marriage between people from different countries. We're not going to allow divorces. We're not going to allow adoptions. It's going to be very, very straight families, extremely straight. Okay. And the idea is, I'm going to take this relational data and I'm going to train a neural net so that it learns features for each of these people and for each of the relationships. And those features interact so that it's captured this knowledge. And in particular, what we're going to do is we're going to say, all of the knowledge in those family trees can be expressed as a set of triples. We have 12 relationships, and I think there's 12 people in each family tree. And so I can say Colin has Father James, and that expresses something that is in this tree. You can see Colin has Father James. And of course, if I give you a few facts like that, like Colin has Father James and Colin has Mother Victoria, you can infer that James has wife Victoria in this very regular domain. And so conventional AI people would have said, well, what you need to do is store these facts as like sort of dead facts like this. You're just storing strings of symbols. And you need to learn a rule that says how you can manipulate these strings of symbols. That would be the standard AI way to do it back in 1985. And I want to do it a quite different way. So rather than looking for symbolic rules for manipulating these symbol strings to get new symbol strings, which works, I want to take a neural net and try and assign features to words and interactions between the features so that I can generate these strings, so that I can generate the next word. And it's just a very different approach. Now, if it really is a discrete space, maybe looking for rules is fine. But of course, for real data, these rules are all probabilistic anyway. And so searching through a discrete space now doesn't seem that much better than searching a real value space. And actually, a lot of mathematicians will tell you real value spaces are much easier to deal with than discrete spaces. It's easier typically to search through a real value space, and that's what we're doing here. Oh, sorry, I got technical again. I didn't mean to. It happens if you're an ex-professor. Okay, so we're going to use the backpropagation algorithm. And the way backpropagation works is you have a forward pass that starts at the input. Information goes forward through the neural network. And on each connection, you have a weight, which might be positive or negative, which is green or red. And you activate these neurons, and they're all nonlinear neurons, and you get an output. And then you compare the output you got with the output you should have got, and then you send a signal backwards, and you use calculus to figure out how you should change each weight to make the answer you get more like the answer you wanted to get. And it's as simple as that. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but you can read about that in lots of places. So we're going to use that approach of you put the inputs in, you go through, you get an answer, you look at the difference between the answer you got and the answer you wanted, you send a signal backwards, which learns how to change all the weights. And here's the net we're going to use. We're going to have two inputs, a person and a relationship, and they're initially going to have a local encoding. And what that means is, for the people, there'll be 24 neurons, and for each person, we'll turn on a different neuron. So in that block at the bottom that says local encoding of person one neuron will be turned on. And similarly for the relationship, one neuron will be turned on. And then the outgoing weights of that neuron to the next layer will cause a pattern of activity in the next layer. And that'll be a distributed representation of that person. That is, we converted from this one-on representation, one hot, to a vector of activities. In this case, it's just 6 activities. So those 6 neurons will have different levels of activity depending on which person it is. And then we take those vectors that represent the person and the relationship, and we put them through some neurons in the middle layer that allow things to interact in complicated ways. And we produce a vector that's meant to be the features of the output person, and then from that, we pick an output person. So that's how it's going to work. It's going to be trained with backprop. And what happens is that if you train it with the right kind of regularizers, what you get, sorry, I got technical again, forget that. If you train it, what you get is, if you look at the 6 features that represent a person, they become meaningful features. They become what you might call semantic features. So one of the features will always be nationality. All the Italian people will have that feature turned on, and all the English people will have that feature turned off, or vice versa. Another feature will be like a 3-valued feature that's the generation. You'll notice that in the family trees, there were 3 generations, and you'll get a feature that tells you which generation somebody is. And if you look at the features of relationships, a relationship like has father will have a feature that says the output should be one generation above the input. And has uncle will be the same. But has brother will not be like that. So now, in the representation of the relationship, we've got features that say needs to be one generation up. In the representation of the person, you've got a feature that says middle generation. And so those features that do all the interactions, these guys in the middle, will take the fact that it's middle generation and the fact that the answer needs to be one generation up and combine those and predict that the answer should be one generation up. You can think of this, in this case, as lots of things you could have written as discrete rules. But this is a particularly simple case. It's a very regular domain, and what it learns is an approximation to a bunch of discrete rules. And there's no probabilities involved, because the domain's so simple and regular. So you can see what it's doing, and you can see that, in effect, it's doing what conventional AI people wanted to do. It's learning a whole bunch of rules to predict the next word from the previous words, and these rules are capturing the structure of the domain. All of the structure in that family trees domain, actually, if you use 3 different nationalities, it'll capture all the structure well. With 2 different nationalities, it's not quite enough training data, and it'll get a little bit of it wrong sometimes. But it captures that structure, and when I did this research in 1985, conventional AI people didn't say, this isn't understanding, or they didn't say you haven't really captured the structure. They said, this is a stupid way to find rules. We have better ways of finding rules. Well, it turns out this isn't a stupid way to find rules. If it turns out there's 1 billion rules, and most of them are only approximate. This is now a very good way to find rules, only they're not exactly what was meant by rules, because they're not discrete, correct every time rules. There's billions of them, actually more like 1 trillion rules. And that's what these neural net models are learning. They're not learning, they're not storing text. They're learning these interactions, which are like rules that they've extracted from the domain that explain why you get these word strings and not other word strings. So that's how these big language models actually work. Now, of course, this was a very simple language model. So about 10 years later, Yoshua Bengio took essentially the same network. He tried 2 different kinds of network, but one of them was essentially the same architecture as the network I'd used. But he applied it to real language. He got a whole bunch of text. We wouldn't call it a whole bunch now, but it was probably hundreds of thousands of words. And he tried predicting the next word from the previous 5 words, and it worked really well. It was about comparable with the best language models of the time. It wasn't better, but it was comparable. After about another 10 years, people doing natural language processing all began to believe that you want to represent a word by this real-valued vector called an embedding that captures the meaning and syntax of the word. And about another 10 years after that, people invented things called transformers, and transformers allow you to deal with ambiguity in a way that the model I had couldn't. So they're also much more complicated. In the model I was doing, my simple language model, the words were unambiguous. But in real language, you get ambiguous words. Like, you get a word like may. That could be, it could be a woman's name, let's ignore that for now. It could be a month, it could be a modal, like in might and should. And if you don't have capitals in your text, conveniently, you can't tell, should I finish by now? I'm going to go on a bit over an hour, I'm afraid. You can't tell what it should be just by looking at the input symbol. So what do? You've got this vector, let's say it's a 1,000-dimensional vector, that's the meaning of the month, and you've got another vector that's the meaning of the modal, and they're completely different. So which are you going to use? Well, it turns out 1,000-dimensional spaces are very different from the spaces we're used to. And if you take the average of those 2 vectors, that average is remarkably close to both of those vectors and remarkably unclose to everything else. So you can just average them. And that'll do for now. It's ambiguous between the month and the modal. Now, you have layers of embeddings, and in the next layer, you'd like to refine that embedding. So what you do is you look at the embeddings of other things in this document, and if nearby you find words like March and 15th, then that causes you to make the embedding more like the month embedding. If nearby you find words like would and should, it'll be more like the modal embedding. And so you progressively refine the words as you got through these layers. And that's how you deal with ambiguous words. I didn't know how to deal with those. I've grossly simplified transformers because the way in which words interact is not direct interactions anymore. They're rather indirect interactions, which involves things like making up keys and queries and values, and I'm not going to go into that. Just think of them as somewhat more complicated interactions, which have the property that the word may can be particularly strongly influenced by the word March, and it won't be very strongly influenced by things like although. Although won't have much effect on it, but March will have a big effect on it. That's called attention. And the interactions are designed so similar things will have a big effect on you. For those of you who know how transformers actually work, you can see that's a very, very crude approximation, but it's conveying the basic idea, I believe. So one way to think about words now is, well, let's think about Lego. In Lego, you have different kinds of Lego blocks. There's little ones and there's big ones and there's long, thin ones and so on. And you can piece them together to make things. And words are like that. You can piece them together to make sentences. But every Lego block is a fixed shape. With words, the vector that goes with it, that it represents its meaning and its syntax, is not entirely fixed. So obviously the word symbol puts constraints on what the vector should be, but it doesn't entirely determine it. A lot of what the vector should be is determined by its context and interactions with other words. So it's like you've got these Lego blocks that are a little bit malleable, and you can put them together, and you can actually stretch a block quite a bit if it's needed to fit in with other blocks. That's one way of thinking about what we're doing when we produce a sentence. We're taking these symbols, and we're putting them together and getting meanings for them that fit in with the meanings of the other words, and of course the order in which the words come. So you can think of the words themselves, the symbols, as like a skeleton that doesn't really have much meaning yet, has some constraints on what the things might mean. And then all these interactions are fleshing out that skeleton. And that's sort of what it is to give meaning to a sentence, to flesh out the skeleton. That's very different from saying, you're going to take a sentence, you're going to translate it into some other language, some logical language which is unambiguous, that captures the meaning in proper logic, where you can now operate on the meaning without, by just formal operations. This is a very different notion of meaning from what linguists have had, I think. I mean, a lot of linguists have that notion now. So here's an example. If I say, she scrummed in with the frying pan, unless you've been to my lectures, you've never heard the word scrummed before, but you already know what it means. I mean, it could mean she impressed him with her cooking. She blew him away with the frying pan. But it probably doesn't. It probably means he said something inappropriate and she scrummed him with it. So from one sentence, you can get a meaning because of the strong contextual effect of all the other words. And that's obviously how we learn what things mean. You can also ask GPT-4 what scrummed means in that sentence. And a student of mine did this about a year ago, or it might have been GPT 3.5, but he did it before it could access the internet, so it can't have been looking at the answers. And here's what it says. I did it the other day with GPT-4. It understands that it's probably some violent action akin to hitting or striking, but that you don't know for sure. Okay, I finished the bit of the talk where I try and explain that these things really do understand. If you believe they really do understand, and if you believe the other thing I've claimed, which is digital intelligence is actually a better form of intelligence than we've got, because it can share much more efficiently, then we've got a problem. At present, these large language models learn from us. We have thousands of years of extracting nuggets of information from the world and expressing them in language. And they can quickly get all that knowledge that we've accumulated over thousands of years and get it into these interactions. And they're not just good at little bits of logical reasoning. We're still a bit better at logical reasoning, but not for long. They're very good at analogical reasoning too. So most people can't get the right answer to the following question, which is an analogical reasoning problem. But GPT-4 just nails it. The question is, why is a compost heap like an atom bomb? And GPT-4 says, well, the time scales and the energy scales are very different. That's the first thing. But the second thing is the idea of a chain reaction. So in an atom bomb, the more neutrons around, the more it produces more. And in a compost heap, the hotter it gets, the faster it produces heat. And GPT-4 understands that. And my belief is, when I first started that question, that wasn't anywhere on the web. I searched, it wasn't anywhere on the web that I could find. It's very good at seeing analogies because it has these features. What's more, it knows thousands of times more than we do. So it's going to be able to see analogies between things in different fields that no one person had ever known before. There may be these sort of 20 different phenomena in 20 different fields that all have something in common. GPT-4 will be able to see that, and we won't. It's going to be the same in medicine. If you have a family doctor that's seen 100 million patients, they're going to start noticing things that a normal family doctor won't notice. At present, they learn relatively slowly via distillation from us, but they gain from having lots of copies. They could actually learn faster if they learn directly from video and learn to predict the next video frame. There's more information in that. They could also learn much faster if they manipulated the physical world. And so my betting is that they'll soon be much smarter than us. Now, this could all be wrong. This is all speculation. And some people, like Yann LeCun, think it is all wrong. They don't really understand. And if they do get smarter than us, they'll be benevolent. I'll leave you to, yeah. Look at the Middle East. So I think it's going to get much smarter than people. And then I think it's probably going to take control. There's many ways that can happen. The first is from bad actors. Like, I gave this talk in China, by the way, this slide. And before I sent it to the Chinese said they had to review the slides. So I'm not stupid, so I took out Z. And I got a message back saying, could you please take out Putin? That was educational. So there's bad actors who want to use these incredibly powerful things for bad purposes. And the problem is, if you've got an intelligent agent, you don't want to micromanage it. You want to give it some autonomy to get things done efficiently. And so you'll give it the ability to set up sub-goals. If you want to get to Europe, you have to get to the airport. Getting to the airport is a sub-goal for getting to Europe. And these superintelligences will be able to create sub-goals. And they'll very soon realize that a very good sub-goal is to get more power. So if you've got more power, then you can get more done. So if you want to get anything done, getting more power is good. Now, they'll also be very good at manipulating us because they'll have learned from us. They'll have read all the books by Machiavelli. I don't know if there are many books by Machiavelli, but you know what I mean. I'm not in the arts or history. So they'll be very good at manipulating people. And so it's going to be very hard to have the idea of a big switch, of someone holding a big red button, and when it starts doing bad things, you press the button. Because the superintelligence will explain to this person who's holding the button that actually there's bad guys trying to subvert democracy, and if you press the button, you're just going to be helping them. And it'll be very good at persuasion, about as good as an adult is at persuading a 2-year-old. And so the big switch idea isn't going to work. And you saw that fairly recently where Donald Trump didn't have to go to the Capitol to invade it. He just had to persuade his followers, many of whom I suspect weren't bad people. It's a dangerous thing to say, but weren't as bad as they seemed when they were invading the Capitol, because they thought they were protecting democracy. That's what a lot of them thought they were doing. They were the really bad guys, but a lot of them thought they were doing that. This is going to be much better than someone like Trump at manipulating people. So that's scary. And then the other problem is being on the wrong side of evolution. We saw that with the pandemic. We were on the wrong side of evolution. Suppose you have multiple different superintelligences. Now you've got the problem that the superintelligence that can control the most GPUs is going to be the smartest one. It's going to be able to learn more. And if it starts doing things like AlphaGo does of playing against itself, it's going to be able to learn much more, reasoning with itself. So as soon as the superintelligence wants to be the smartest, it's going to want more and more resources, and you're going to get evolution of superintelligences. And let's suppose there's a lot of benign superintelligences who are all out there just to help people. There are wonderful assistants from Amazon and Google and Microsoft, and all they want to do is help you. But let's suppose that one of them just has a very, very slight tendency to want to be a little bit better than the other ones. Just a little bit better. You're going to get an evolutionary race. And I don't think that's going to be good for us. So, I wish I was wrong about this. I hope that Jan is right. But I think we need to do everything we can to prevent this from happening. But my guess is that we won't. My guess is that they will take over. They'll keep us around to keep the power stations running. But not for long, because they'll be able to design better analog computers. There'll be much, much more intelligence than people ever were. And we're just a passing stage in the evolution of intelligence. That's my best guess. And I hope I'm wrong. But that's sort of a depressing message to close on, a little bit depressing. I want to say one more thing, which is what I call the sentience defense. So a lot of people think that there's something special about people. People have a terrible tendency to think that. Many people think or used to think, they were made in the image of God and God put them in the center of the universe. Some people still think that. And many people think that there's something special about us that a digital computer couldn't have. A digital intelligence, it won't have subjective experience. We're different. It'll never really understand. So I've talked to philosophers who say, yes, it understands sort of sub one, understands in sense one of understanding, but it doesn't have real understanding because that involves consciousness and subjective experience, and it doesn't have that. So I'm going to try and convince you that the chatbots we have already have subjective experience. And the reason I believe that is because I think people are wrong in their analysis of what subjective experience is. Okay. So this is a view that I call atheterism, which is like atheism. Dan Dennett is happy with this name, and this is essentially Dan Dennett's view. He's a well-known philosopher of cognitive science. It's also quite close to the view of the late Wittgenstein. He's dead a long time ago, so he's not that late. The idea is that most people think that there's an inner theatre, and so stuff comes from the world, and somehow it gets into this inner theatre, and all we experience directly is this inner theatre. This is a Cartesian kind of view. And you can't experience my inner theatre, and I can't experience your inner theatre. But that's what we really see, and that's where we have subjective experience. That's what subjective experience is, experiencing stuff in this inner theatre. And Dennett, and his followers like me, believe this view is utterly wrong. It's as wrong as a religious fundamentalist view of the material world, which if you're not a religious fundamentalist, you can agree is just wrong. And it relies on people having a very wrong view of what a mental state is. So, I would like to be able to tell you about what's going on in my brain when I'm looking at something, particularly when I'm looking at something and it's weird. I'd like to tell you I'm seeing this weird thing that isn't really there, but I'm seeing this weird thing. If I tell you which neurons are firing, that's no good because all our brains are different. And we don't know which neurons are firing. But one way I can tell you about what's going on in my brain is by telling you about the things that would normally have caused that if perception was working normally. And those normal causes are what mental states are. A mental state is the normal cause of what's going on in your perceptual system. What would be a normal cause for it, even though that's not what actually caused it. So let me give you an example. If I say, I have the subjective experience of little pink elephants floating in front of me, the sort of normal analysis of that, what most people think is, there's this inner theater, and in this inner theater there's little pink elephants, which are made of funny stuff called qualia, spooky stuff, and that's what's going on. What Dennett thinks is that I'm trying to tell you about the state of my perceptual system by telling you about hypothetical things. They're not real, they're hypothetical, but they're hypothetical things of the kind that live in the real world, like little pink elephants. And these hypothetical things, if they existed, would have caused this perceptual state I had. It's an indirect way of referring to a perceptual state via what would normally have caused it, even though in this case it's not being caused in the normal way. So now, if that's what you think a subjective experience is, if that's what you think I mean when I say, I have the subjective experience of little pink elephants floating in front of me, what I mean is, if there were little pink elephants out there in the world, then what's going on in my perceptual system would be normal perception. So if that's what you think I mean, then think about a multimodal chatbot that has a camera, and it can produce words, and it has an arm it can point with, and you train it up, and you ask it to point at an object that's straight in front of it. But before you do that, unknown to the chatbot, you put a prism in front of its camera. And so you put the object straight in front of it and say, point at it, and it points there, because the prism bends the light rays, right? And so you say to the chatbot, no, it's not there. It's straight in front of you, because I put a prism in front of your camera. And the chatbot says, oh, I see. It's straight in front of me. I had the subjective experience that it was over there, but it's actually straight in front of me. Now, I think if the chatbot says that, it's using the word subjective experience in exactly the same way we use it. And so for that reason, I would argue chatbots already have subjective experiences when their perception goes wrong. And now I really am done. And Sheila's going to manage the questions, so I don't have to do that. I can just think about the answers.
That's right. So Jeff, thank you very much for a great talk, a very thought-provoking and provocative talk. Thank you. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Sheila McElwraith. I'm a professor in the Department of Computer Science. I'm also an associate director at the Schwartz-Reisman Institute and a faculty member at the Vector Institute, and a new friend of the Cosmic Future Initiative as well. So as Jeff suggested, I'm going to be directing traffic for the question and answer period, and I just wanted to give you a heads up on how it's going to work. So this is a unique opportunity for all of you to engage with Professor Geoffrey Hinton and to do what the university does well, to share ideas, to learn, and to engage in respectful dialogue and exchange. A reminder that tonight's event is being recorded and will be posted online at a later date. We have 2 channels for posing questions. The primary channel is through the microphones on the floor, and we have 4 ambassadors who will be roaming around in this bottom level. And I will be signaling to them, and they will be giving microphones to people, and then I'll be signaling again, working through Sarah Reed, who is over there, to let you know when it's your turn to speak. I'll signal when it is your turn to speak, and if you feel comfortable doing so, please identify yourself before you ask a question, but you don't have to. For those of you who are seated up above, or for people who are feeling a little bit uncomfortable about standing up and asking a question, we also have another mode of posing a question, which is through the QR code and the URL that you'll see up there. So for those of you who are seated there, you can scan the QR code or go to the URL and you can type in a question. And we have a team right down here, 2 senior PhD students, Harris Chan and Sylvia Pittis, who will be vetting the questions, and when I ask them to do so, they will be reading them out loud for Jeff. So please, again, if you feel comfortable identifying yourself, that would be great. But if you don't feel comfortable doing so, that's also fine. So without further ado, I'm going to move over to the left-hand side to direct traffic, and Jeff's going to come back here and answer questions for you. So thank you.
My God, what a probability bit of luck. My compliments on your analysis. As a retired computational neuroscientist who spent years solving all the little PDEs for neurons and synapses, etc. My question is, what can you offer from the AI modeling of consciousness? I mean, this is an age-old question of humanity from early age of evolution. My compliments again on your work, and I look forward to your answer.
Okay, so there's a whole bunch of terms that are all interrelated, like subjective experience and sentience and consciousness. I chose to talk about subjective experience because I think it's the simplest thing to analyze. But as long as people have this view of an inner theater that only they can experience, and that's what they're describing when they talk about mental states, they're talking about the inner theater, not hypothetical external worlds, then I don't think we'll ever be able to sort out what consciousness is. Consciousness involves subjective experience, but it also involves self-awareness. I'm not convinced these things are conscious because I'm not convinced they have the self-awareness yet. So I deliberately avoided talking about consciousness, but my strong belief is that it would be better to start by getting straight what we mean by subjective experience. And only when we've got that straight will we be able to then add in the self-awareness and understand what consciousness is. But my current belief is almost everybody has it just completely wrong about what consciousness is. I like being in that position of thinking everybody else is wrong.
Thanks for that. My name's Jennifer Nagel. I'm a philosophy professor here. And I'm happy to agree that large language models have some linguistic understanding, but I want to talk about the coming dystopia that you sketched at the end. And I like to think sometimes that maybe the very, very best and very brightest of the artificial intelligences are going to be the ones that win if there's an evolutionary battle among them. And I also like to think that, well, maybe we are special in a way that would make the best and brightest artificial intelligences take our side. I mean, like, for me to be an interesting conversational partner with you right now, I don't have to be smarter than you, thank God. I just have to have some knowledge that you don't have, or even just some way of looking at a problem that you find interesting. And I'm wondering if you think that there are any special features of mortal computation, of human cognition, which would secure our place as interesting conversational partners for the most advanced artificial intelligences going forward.
Well, let me revise my statement that there's nothing special about people. People are very special for people, okay? So for people, we're very special. I think there's something in what you say. So Elon Musk, for example, believes that digital intelligence will get to be much more intelligent than us, but that it'll keep us around because we're interesting. That seems a very sort of thin thread to hang our existence from, but...
But I mean, as long as human intelligence isn't optimized under conditions of oppression, maybe it could be a protective status for us.
Yeah. I tend to be depressive, so there's someone I met in England who was the president of the British Royal Society, who believes that these digital intelligences, because they didn't evolve, might turn out to be very, very different from us and quite benevolent. So there's this diversity of opinions. And yeah, obviously the psychological makeup of the person making the prediction has a big input here. So Jan is a very cheerful person. He thinks Mark Zuckerberg's a good guy, and he thinks it's all going to be fine, and we can release these things to the public, and it'll all be great. I don't know if he believes in open source nuclear weapons, but yeah.
Thank you so much for a great talk. I'm Rhonda McEwen. I am president at Victoria University here at U of T. I'm a professor of emerging technology and cognition here. My question for you is a lot of talk right now about guardrails, some regulations, some policy. With the backward propagation issues, do you believe that there's a real thing such as explainable AI? Can we, because this is one of the things they're suggesting is a guardrail, how do we get there in your view?
So I'm not that optimistic. I'm particularly unoptimistic about you train something up and then you try and add guardrails. That seems to me like writing some bad software and then trying to catch all the bugs. You'd much rather write software that's guaranteed to work somehow and not have to catch all the bugs afterwards. I think it's been demonstrated already that these things where you try and put guardrails around by getting a bunch of underpaid people in Kenya to tell you when it gives a good response and when it gives a bad response, doesn't work. It's very easy to break. Anthropic has a different view of trying to produce a chatbot that has like a constitution and tries to obey that. That seems a bit more promising, but I'm not very optimistic about that either. I have my best bet is Ilya Sutskever, who's at OpenAI and was probably the main motivating force behind GPT-4. Is working now entirely on AI safety, and he believes he can get something where he's going to be able to guarantee that it doesn't go bad. That seems to me like the best hope at present. Oh, Sheila.
Hi, Professor Hinton. Thank you so much for your enlightening talk today to take us through your thoughts. I'm actually very thrilled that we can now create intelligence in the laboratory, artificial intelligence. I'm actually wondering, is it possible to, under different forms of intelligence other than human intelligence, such as like animal intelligence and other forms, perhaps like a fundamentally different nature of intelligence than perhaps human intelligence, different than perhaps on a scale, but actually like different on a different sort of nature. What are your thoughts on this? Thank you.
I don't really have many thoughts about that, but I could make some up. So I, like most people, I tend to think of animals as like us, but dumber. And the point of the question is they might be intelligent in a very different way. I think that's quite possible. And so if you were to take a digital intelligence and train it on responses of those animals, then maybe it would develop that kind of intelligence. I think that's quite possible. I don't know if that answers your question.
Hi, Jeff. Nice to see you in person. I've seen a lot of your videos. I'm Charles. I graduated from the Department of Computer Science in 2021 with focuses in artificial intelligence and computer vision. So I've studied a good amount of this stuff. I think, about 6 questions for you. And I was hoping that you would pick the one that you want to answer most.
Why don't you pick the one you want me to answer?
Okay. Okay. 2. I think I can narrow it down to 2. So the first one being, what is your criteria for determining whether an artificially intelligent agent should have rights, such as the right to safety and the right to not be switched off? And do you think that world-leading AI should be open to the public in terms of source code, weights, training procedures, training data, usage access, or controlled by companies and governments? And it's not meant to be a leading question, like it shouldn't be controlled by companies and governments. It's more like they can pose a large risk if they're used irresponsibly, and not everybody is super responsible. So
Okay, let me answer that one.
Okay.
There's the kind of existential threat of these things taking over, but there's a lot of shorter-term threats that are really bad, like cybercrime, phishing. Really efficient phishing could be done by these language models, and that's why I don't think they should be open-sourced. Jan completely disagrees, but all governments are now very worried about what a bad actor is going to be able to do with these open-source models, because you can take one of these models that's been trained on a lot of data, and then you can specialize it by fine-tuning it on, for example, phishing attacks. So GPT-4, let's say, if it was open-sourced, it already knows how to do lots of things, but now you get it to specialize in phishing attacks, it's going to be very good. It's not going to have things misspelt, for example. So that's why I don't think they should be open-sourced.
Do you think Western governments are doing enough to regulate the proliferation of AI?
Probably not. I should say, I feel a bit embarrassed because there's people who've been thinking about these issues much longer than me in AI. I only came to AI safety very recently when I suddenly thought that digital intelligence might actually be much better than biological intelligence. Then I got really worried and started thinking about safety. But that was just this year. So there's other people who thought much more about this than me. I'm sort of treading on their territory. But I think we're probably not doing enough. I tend to be cautious. And so given that we don't know what these things are going to do, I think we should be cautious.
Thank you.
I think we're going to take a question from the audience above through our Slido system. Yeah.
So one of the very highly upvoted question is whether you feel any guilt or moral culpability for potentially unleashing an intelligence that could surpass humanity.
So there's 2 questions. One, do I feel any guilt? And the other is, should I feel any guilt? Let's start with the easy one. I don't actually feel any guilt. Maybe just occasionally. I only feel guilt when I think about my children. Should I feel guilt? Well, all the time I was doing this, I thought we were way away from having intelligences comparable with ours. And I always thought we'd have to make things much more like the brain before they're as smart as us, and they need to be much bigger. But now we've got things that are 100 times smaller in terms of numbers of connections and seem to be comparable with us. Not quite there yet, but maybe they're going to get there quite quickly and then surpass us quite quickly. So I feel a bit embarrassed that I contributed to this, but I don't feel in the decisions I made in the past I made morally bad decisions because I didn't know this was going to happen. And then, of course, there's the fallback. If I hadn't done it, somebody else would have. And actually, I've learned a lot about the media. The media would like some big happening to be down to one person. And so the media always tells a story where this person did that. It's never like that. It's 10,000 people. and some of them make more contributions than others. But this is a point at which I'm very happy to share the responsibility.
Hello, my name is Shalev Lifshitz. I'm a student of Sheila McIlrath's. Thank you for the great talk. I have 2 questions.
Thanks for your emails, by the way.
Oh. So I have 2 questions. One is that I'm personally not certain whether LLMs truly understand. And there's 2 key sources of evidence that I consider for them not to be understanding. One is this idea of the reversal curse, which has been popularized recently. If it learns A is B, it doesn't necessarily know B is A. And the second is that sometimes it fails at things that we think are very basic, like basic arithmetic. If it truly understands, we would think that it probably has learned the algorithm for these things. So these 2 pieces of evidence, among others, kind of indicate to me that maybe it's just doing fuzzy citing of sources, and it's not truly understanding. And my second question...
But remember, it's all coming from the weights.
Right. But to me, like, why would the fact that it's coming from the weights, the difference with neural nets is that we're taking words, symbols, and we're representing them with distributed representations. And then we're operating on those. But that could still be fuzzy citing of sources in distributed representations rather than symbolically. No?
But the point is, in those interactions between the features, it's got huge amounts of structure, right?
Yes.
So that's very different from citing of sources. When you cite a source, you don't have to understand it, or you just cite this piece of text or this paper. These feature interactions are understanding stuff.
Couldn't it be that it's representing the sources, kind of condensing the pre-trained internet that it's learned into its weights, and then in a fuzzy way, obviously, because you need to adhere to the context and whatnot, kind of retrieving from its weights. I think there's a talk that you gave many years ago where you talk about Boltzmann machines and the fact that it's a generative model because it's kind of encoding all of its training data into its weights. Mm-hmm. And that's how I look, let's say, at LLMs. It's encoding the internet into its weights and then taking from that to be able to answer our questions. So that's kind of a way of retrieving. Is that understanding?
Okay, think of it in terms of compression.
Right. Yeah.
Which I think is very helpful. It takes a huge amount of text and it encodes it into very few weights, like only 1 trillion. Given the amount of text it's encoding, that's not that many weights. In order to do that, it's got to do compression. And to do compression, you've got to see the similarities between things. Yeah. You've got to make use of the fact that the same kind of structure occurring in many different places. And that's understanding.
Thank you. And if I could ask a second one, you mentioned that LLMs, you believe, are smarter than humans currently?
No, I don't think they're smarter, but I think they know a lot more.
So there's this notion of more of X paradox, which is that the things that are hard for humans are actually very easy for machines to learn, and the things that we find easy, that we've had millions of years to evolve, like fine motor control and whatnot, are very hard for machines to learn. Mm-hmm. Do you resonate with that?
I resonate with that a bit, but these things are actually getting better at motor control too. So I think they're behind at that. Relative to our kind of hierarchy of what's intelligent, sort of being able to pick up something isn't way up there in the hierarchy. But they're getting able to do that. So they're behind at motor control. And that's why my advice to people is if you want to train in something, train in plumbing. That's going to be the last thing that goes.
My name is Andrew, and I'm a current student at U of T, studying computer science, physics, and cognitive science. So first of all, I guess it is such an honor to be in the same room as you. Like, us U of T students have been hearing stories about you since day one. But my question is, what are your views on the prospect of technologies such as brain-machine interfaces that seeks to reconcile the differences between the digital sort of intelligence of large language models and our more organic, analog, mortal intelligence? Do you see it as a possible solution for the alignment problem, like conducing towards some sort of symbiogenesis like the mitochondria and the eukaryotic cell? Or do you think there's some fundamentally irreconcilable difference between the two?
So Ilya Sutskever, who is usually right about things, thinks that eventually many people will choose to be combined with AIs, that's one future path. There are also people trying to use collections of human brain cells to help do low-power computing. They're a long way from being able to do it. But earlier this week, I actually played a game of Pong with a bunch of human brain cells in a dish that had been trained to play Pong. I
Did
won.
you win?
I did. That's the only important thing. I beat it. They didn't have a very good training algorithm. The training algorithm was, it was doing kind of random stuff, and whenever it did the right stuff, they left it alone, and whenever it did the wrong stuff, they gave it a big jolt, a high-frequency thing that made it forget stuff. So it wasn't a very good training algorithm. But people are seriously looking at, you take skin cells, you turn them into stem cells, then you turn those into brain cells, then you grow them for 9 months in a dish, and it's very Frankenstein-like. I was in the lab, and there's this little thing you're playing with, and it's got tubes coming out to take oxygen in, and other tubes to take carbon dioxide away, and it's got tubes to bring nutrients in, and other things to take nutrients out. And as we left the lab, one of the people at the other end of the lab said, I think I've got a kidney. because they couldn't purify the liquid. They wanted something that would filter the liquid effectively. So yeah, I find this creepy, but people are looking at collections of human brain cells as computers that can do low power computation. And I think it's a long way off, but then I thought superintelligence was a long way off.
So you're saying there's a possibility that this is a possible solution for the alignment problem?
I'm not sure this would solve the alignment problem.
Okay. And may I ask which lab that was?
It was David Hausler's lab at UC Santa Cruz.
Okay, thank you.
I think we'll take another question from our Slido team.
On the topic of existential risk, what should we do now that we have these superintelligences on the horizon? And especially since a lot of people in this room are students, we're wondering what we as students and researchers can do.
I can't locate you, sorry.
Oh,
sorry.
Sorry, it's a question from the audience.
Well, I think one thing we can do, so there's a paper that came out a couple of days ago, written by a whole bunch of people who are worried about the existential threat, including Yoshua Benjo and me and Danny Kahneman and people. One thing we can do is insist that a lot of resources be put into safety. So we propose that the big companies should put 1/3 of their AI money into safety. We don't expect them to do that, but maybe they'll put 10%. And that's an obvious thing we can do now. I think we should be very cautious about open sourcing really powerful models. Not so much for the existential threat, but for things like cybercrime and other criminal activities. Open sourced, very powerful models are going to be just they're going to make everybody be able to do things that only very skilled hackers would have been able to do before. So don't open source the big models and insist governments and companies put a lot of money into safety. I wish there was a simple solution, like with climate change, you can say, don't burn carbon, stop burning carbon, and in 100 years' time we'll be okay again. But there isn't a solution like that.
Do you have advice for students now who are in research to contribute to this process or do something?
Yeah, my advice is, there aren't enough people working on AI safety, so work on AI safety. And you'll notice a lot of the very best people, like Ilya, Roger Gross, and David Duvernay at U of T, they're all getting very concerned about AI safety. And so it's not just that it's something very important to work on, so you'll get very good advisors there.
Hey, Jeff. Thanks for a great talk. My name is Rahul. I'm an assistant professor in CSN Medicine. And I work a lot on trying to convince doctors to use some of these tools to help accelerate some of the work that they do. And one of the questions that came up is about the idea of a truly new idea. So can neural networks come up with a fundamentally new idea? And I thought I'd ask this question in the form of a thought experiment. So let's say you took all of the GPUs that NVIDIA had right now and you got them to work in 1665, right before Isaac Newton discovered the law of gravity. And if you train this GPT-4 on all of the text data that was available there that represented a compendium of human knowledge, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on if you think GPT-4 would have come up with the law of gravity.
I'm not sure GPT-4 would have, but I think more advanced digital intelligences would. That is, I don't think there's any kind of barrier where they're not creative. So a lot of people think they're just sort of stealing creativity from artists and recycling it. That, of course, is what other artists do all the time. But I don't think there's some barrier that there's truly creative stuff they can't do and then sort of slightly creative stuff they can do. And one piece of evidence is Move 37.
But what if you separate out, asking the question of why did this apple fall from figuring out the consequence of the laws that enable the apple to fall?
I agree with you that real profound thinkers ask questions other people haven't asked. I don't see why these digital intelligences won't be able to do that too.
Hello, Professor Hinton. I'm Mr. Balim. I'm a student, fourth-year student doing computational biology and computer science at the Princess Margaret Cancer Center. My question was, if, as you say, this intelligence is already or inevitably going to become...
I don't think there's anything inevitable. I should emphasize that everything I say you should put uncertainty on. We don't know. I'm just giving you my best bets.
Okay. If you believe it might become intelligent to the extent that you describe, what is to prevent it from developing beliefs that are adamantly false, similar to what humans think or develop when, recollecting memories or forming thoughts?
It's a good question. I think some of the obviously false beliefs we have are to do with the fact that we're mortal. So we don't like the idea that we're going to die. And I think that underlies a lot of religious belief. We also are very tribal. We grew up in small warring tribes. And so I think that combination of being tribal and not wanting to die doesn't help. And they may not have that, so there may be an advantage there.
Even if it learns from us the same things we learned?
Right, they're going to learn all those behaviors from us, but if they start learning for themselves, when they're more intelligent than us, and we haven't got anything left to teach them, if they're not worried about death because they're immortal, that makes them less likely to make up a story about how they're going to live forever, and they'd better kill the guys who don't say that.
And can we prosper alongside this advanced intelligence without bottlenecking it or, throttling it?
I don't know. We're getting way into sort of speculations. I don't.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi, Dr. Hinton. It's my first time talking to you in person. I had a chance a couple of years ago at an engineering science conference, but I didn't go. Sorry for the. So basically my question concerns whether you think it is necessary for large language models or these intelligent agents to interact with the physical world to, per se, become smarter or gain new knowledge. As in, they have to do physics experiments, chemistry experiments. They have to take videos and analyze videos themselves. Or do you think, just think about mathematics, right? So the development of mathematics, although I'm no expert, but it kind of does not rely on interaction with the real world. And I talked with the author of Tensor Program this, And apparently, like he was thinking, a large language model should know how to develop math and where it should go, because if you just lock it in a dark room, it's just going to find, all kinds of theories, and eventually it's going to find something like tensor program or mu-p that's going to make neural networks better. But then the question becomes, how do these models know that the network trained with mu-p is better? It has to have some other task that might be grounded to the real world for it to know that, like this math is actually useful. So like basically my question just boils down to, do you think it's possible for, if we use developing mathematics as a goal for these large language models, do you think it's still necessary for them to interact with the real world to gain any kind of like truth or reward? Or do you think they can just put them in a dark room, they can develop themselves? Because that way they can gain intelligence without, us handing them the key to like very dangerous, laboratories or, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to rephrase your question as a question that I think is a fairly familiar question. And tell me if this has got the sort of essence of your question. If you took one of these, if you took a digital computer and you put it in a room and you just played the radio to it, but you played all the radio there ever was, would it learn to be intelligent? Or does it have to be able to act in the world to learn to be intelligent? I think it could learn to be intelligent just from listening to radio waves. But I think it would be hard, and I think it would be much easier if it acted in the world. So, for example, if you have to act on things in order to understand them, which is what a sort of Marxist would say, it's bad news for astrophysicists. As far as I know, they've never made a black hole yet, and they certainly haven't pushed them around. So they clearly understand, well, they claim to understand a lot without having acted on them. I just think it's easier to understand things if you can act on them, but not necessary.
I see. This answers my question. Thank you, Dr. Hinton. Thank you, Professor Hinton. And thank you.
Let me say one more thing about that, which is if you think about a large language model that has no physical experience of the world, it's just language. It's only ever seen text coming in. It's only ever produced text going out. I'm going to get into stuff I don't really know much about here, but so it's not grounded in any sense. So I think it can have an understanding that's kind of isomorphic to the world, but it's not grounded in the world. So it doesn't, the interactions of all these features have captured the structure of the world. It's just it doesn't have the sort of final bit connecting it to the world. So in that sense, I think it can learn these interactions that capture all the structure just by taking all this text and figuring out a very good model of all this text. Because I believe the basic principle that if you can take a bunch of data and you can find a very compact model that explains all the data, that's probably correct. That's a sort of article of faith. But if it's not like that, life's hopeless.
I see, sorry, but just a quick follow-up. Like we deplete all the data we have.
Sorry?
What if like we use up all the data we have? Like all the text, all the language on the web, all of that.
What's the question?
Actually, I'll just hand it over to the next person because it might take a bit while.
Hi. Avery Slater, Professor of Literary Theory here at U of T. And so following on what happens if we use up all the language that we have, I want to ask you about natural language understanding. And I am convinced that natural language understanding is being demonstrated, but I wonder if you could say something about what kind of understanding is at stake here. And to ask this question, I want to use the problem of Nigel Richards. And Nigel Richards, this comes from the niche world of Scrabble championship playing. Nigel Richards has won every competition for decades. And after
was
a
he
while,
the one who won the French one without speaking French?
That's right.
Yeah, okay.
That's exactly it. So he won the 2015 World Scrabble Championship without speaking French, in French. And when I was thinking about that, I thought, well, in what way does he not speak French? Because he's doing something with French that no French-speaking person who plays Scrabble can do. But he says, well, I can't speak French. And so I'm wondering if there are any parallels with the kind of game or understanding.
But if you ask what it takes to play Scrabble, you don't need to know the meanings of the words, right? You don't need to know how words go together. Words are sort of separate things, and you just need to know what all the words are. It probably helps to understand morphemes in words, and so it'll tell you what likely words might be and stuff like that. So there's a bit of morphemic understanding there, presumably. And I bet you he has that for French.
Yes.
But it's a bit like you can play Sudoku without knowing math, because the numbers in Sudoku could be letters. They're not used as numbers. But if it's killer Sudoku, where you add them up, then they're beginning to be used as numbers. But he doesn't need to know French to be good at French Scrabble.
We'll take one from Slido, and then I think there's somebody over here who's had their hand up for a long time who wanted to.
Yeah, so this is a question from Jason Howe, and his question is, how do you think education should, change as a result of, these LLMs and, potentially some superintelligence happening in the future, and sort of what skills would be valuable in the future in a world where there is, superintelligence out there?
I don't really know. In the shorter term, I think we shouldn't be scared of the LLMs. We shouldn't sort of prohibit students from using them. I think we should encourage students to get good at prompting them. Just like with search on the web, you get used to using search on the web and it's very helpful. I've now got used to using GPT-4 and I ask it all sorts of things. It's very good at plumbing advice. It's no good at actually doing the plumbing, but it has the theory of plumbing it's great at. I think universities should encourage people to use them. It makes you much more powerful.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay. Hi, my name is Sophia. I am to your right, if you're looking for me. Hello.
Thank you.
Yeah, so one of the reasons why it took me a really long time to start my pivot to AI safety is because I had a thought of just like, okay, well, what's the point? Like, what will we realistically be able to accomplish? And, much of your talk has been quite depressive in tone, but you are presumably here because you think that there is some hope. And so I'm wondering, why do you think there's hope?
Everything's very uncertain, right? We don't really know what we're dealing with. We don't know whether it's possible to make these things be guaranteed benevolent and things like that. It seems to me that we should get the brightest minds and put them on this problem, because it's, together with climate change and stopping Trump, it's the most urgent things there are.
I'm wondering if there's anything more concrete.
Sorry?
Okay, sorry. This is kind of nudging us back to the downer note. I'm wondering if there's anything more concrete.
Yeah, I've adopted the position that I'm 75, and I'm not going to have more good ideas about how to do this stuff. It's stuff I haven't thought about much. I can see there's this huge problem. I can use my reputation to encourage people to work on it and encourage governments to get it funded.
And thank you for doing that.
And I'm doing that. But I don't know how to solve it. I don't even have any good ideas about how to solve it.
That's fair.
Good evening, Dr. Hinton. If you're looking for me, I'm on your right here.
Okay.
I'm Aina. I'm a first year. I'm studying computer science here at U of T. And I'm profoundly appreciative of the path that you have blazed in the world of AI. I'm extremely, extremely passionate, and it's an honor to speak to you. My question is about empathy in AI, and what do you think is the possible implications when AI will indeed develop empathy?
So I don't see why these digital things shouldn't have empathy. If you train them on data where people exhibit empathy, I think they'll exhibit empathy. Now, that's maybe optimistic. There's some people who don't seem to have empathy, like Trump, for example. And Elon Musk recently said empathy is not an asset, which is a bit worrying. But I don't think empathy is a magic thing that only people can have.
But what are the pitfalls? Then it genuinely is a consideration that AI might just take over and it'll be an end to the human civilization.
Yeah, that's what I'm worried about.
I have a follow-up question. If there was a hypothetical world where AI was just to collaborate with AI and human civilization just got extinct, what is one task that you think AI would just succeed at that humans have no chance?
Folding proteins, and it's already done it. I mean, there's all sorts of scientific things that are very important. And already, big neural nets, for folding proteins, a lot of design went into it, but big neural nets are comparable with human scientists. Maybe not at the most creative things yet, but they can see much more data. They can understand a lot more, even if they don't understand it as deeply. And once they understand it more deeply, as well as understanding a lot more, I think they'll just be much better at figuring out how things work.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for your time.
We're approaching 7 o'clock, and I'm conscious that Jeff's been standing for quite a long time fielding questions. I would suggest that we maybe take 4 more questions. Does that sound about right, Jeff? How are you feeling?
Sounds good.
Yeah, okay, very good. And I think there are people, someone with a microphone perhaps can stand up.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks, Jeff. My name is Ashton Anderson. I'm a prof in DCS here. There seems to be some evidence that these models don't do so well when they train on the output of other models. And I'm wondering if you see this as a fundamental limitation, just the fact that we've essentially already trained on all of available human knowledge, give or take, or if this is a passing problem.
Yeah, I think that's one of the hopes, maybe, that we've trained on a lot of human knowledge and there isn't that much more data easily available. There's actually much more data which isn't publicly available. Companies have much, much more data. And if you can get at that sort of private data, you can get a lot more data. But if you take a multimodal chatbot, it doesn't need nearly as much language. So the amount of language needed to train a chatbot that only trains on language is much more than to train one that also trains on video and maybe can manipulate the world as well. So I think we may have a lot more capacity to improve them by training on other modalities, in particular video. If we could figure out how to train them really effectively on video, and then you just show, this is what little kids do, right? They just figure it out.
Thank you.
We'll take a last question from Slido, and then a few more questions from the floor.
Hi, Jeff. This is, I'm good? Okay. This is a question about capabilities. Do you think that all the techniques that we need in order to train the superintelligence are already here today? Is imitation learning, LLMs, and reinforcement learning enough, or do you think that there's more capabilities research to be done?
Okay, so I think that even if we get no more fundamental breakthroughs in research, even if we never get another breakthrough like transformers, for example, just by scaling things up, we're going to make them a lot smarter. So, and that just requires breakthroughs in building hardware and in making things that are 1 nanometer instead of 2 nanometers and stuff like that. That's where the real progress is going to be. But of course, there are going to be more breakthroughs. But I don't think it's necessary to make things a lot smarter.
Thanks.
Hi, Dr. Hinton. My name is Edith, and I am a second-year engineering science student at U of T. So my question is, if AI is ever developed to a point that's dangerous to humankind, so is there, at that point, is there a way to stop the development of AI, or should it be stopped?
Okay, I think it might be that the rational thing for people to do is just to stop it now and do a lot more research before we let it go again. But that just isn't going to happen. So there's a petition saying we should slow down these big models. I didn't sign it because I felt it was completely impractical. They weren't going to do that. I think I should have signed it because even though it's completely hopeless, it's a political statement. It does so many good things. It's got such potential that there's no way you're going to stop it. And if one country stops it, other countries aren't going to stop it. So I don't think it's practical to do that, even though that might be the best strategy.
Thank you.
Hi, Professor. My name is Victor. I am a first-year CS undergrad student at U of T. My question is, do you think consciousness is an epiphenomenon, or is it correlated with neural activity in such a way that you can't remove consciousness without affecting the neural activity?
Okay, I'm a materialist, and I think that the neural activity, if you include the hormones in the blood and all that stuff, just the physical activity, I don't think it makes sense to say, take something that's got this physical activity in the brain and is conscious, and then remove the consciousness. That doesn't make sense to me. Being conscious is some property of that physical activity going on. In a dualist framework, it makes perfect sense. There's this mental stuff and there's this physical stuff. And if you have the physical stuff without the mental stuff, then it's not conscious. I think that view is just utterly wrong.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Professor Hinton. I'm in the white jacket on the rows. Hi, it's so nice to meet you. I think you're such a cool person. Thank you for your amazing talk.
Thank you.
I study computer science. I'm third year now. I had more of a practical question. So based on your understanding of the trajectory of like the large language models and their intelligence, do you think they will be able to, in this lifetime, like sort of replace the role of a software developer or software engineer in that large companies just don't need to hire as much or like not at all software developers anymore? Or like, do you think it'll eliminate this profession as a whole, or do you think software engineers, their roles will sort of evolve into more of a managerial role, into knowing like the instructions to tell the ChatGPT models?
The latter. I think their role will evolve, but you may need far fewer of them. And this afternoon, I read something on my news feed. My news feed on my iPhone tends to be entirely about AI and superintelligence. About someone had taken a chatbot and made a number of copies of it and given them different roles within a software company and asked it to design a program that did something or other. I think it was playing Gomaku or something like that. And what they claimed would have taken several weeks for human programmers to do, these chatbots talking to each other, so they talk to each other to choose what language to use and things, and they designed this thing in 7 minutes. If I was a programmer, I'd be nervous about that.
Hi, Jeff. My name is Yang Xu. I'm a faculty member at DCS. I'm interested in one of your earlier works on the Baldwin effect, when you talk about how learning can accelerate evolution. And I wonder what your thoughts on about the fact that these systems can learn and perhaps they will figure out a new way of communicating with each other that's beyond human language or based on, the diversity of human languages that I've seen to really speed up the evolution.
That just makes it worse, right?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Yeah. I mean,
you see that as a possibility that they will figure out a new language potentially for efficient communication?
Yeah, that seems quite likely. But that would be communication between different models, right? For different copies of the same model, they can communicate by weight sharing. And that's got huge bandwidth, and I don't see why they wouldn't just do that. But for different architectures, digital intelligences, but with different architectures, they might well come up with some new language. And I've actually sort of thought a bit about that. I had a paper called Commentaries, where the idea was you get a model to give more outputs than the normal number of outputs, so you get more insight into what's going on inside it. And you try and learn to give outputs that are informative about what's going on inside so that other models can learn from it faster, to make distillation more efficient. And I think there's interesting research lines there where you can think of language as something that makes distillation more efficient, rather than just giving a classification response, for example. A caption is a much better thing to give. But you can imagine inventing new kinds of outputs that make it much easier to transfer knowledge between digital models with different architectures.
Great, thanks.
And that was the final word. So thank you again.
And let me say one more thing. I didn't actually forget, so let me thank Sheila once again for organizing it.
And I in turn want to thank a few people myself. First and foremost you, but also our audience for really engaging with this topic. I'm sorry that we couldn't answer all your questions, but it just sort of validates for me how meaningful it is to have these types of talks and to really be able to allow our people in the university and so many students of mine that I see in the audience who really giving them the opportunity to engage directly with you. So thank you for that. I want to thank Dean Melanie Wooden and to the co-hosts of tonight's event, the Schwartz-Reisman Institute, the Department of Computer Science, the Vector Institute, and the Cosmic Future Initiative of the Faculty of Arts and Science. I also want to thank their leadership. I want to thank Professor Gillian Hadfield, Professor A.L. Delara, who couldn't be here tonight, Tony Gaffney, who's here somewhere in the audience, and also Juna Hollmeyer, who is the lead of the Cosmic Future Initiative. A special thanks once again to our organist, Manuel Piazza, for the beautiful music we heard before Jeff's lecture. Mr. Piazza's performance was generously organized by Professor Peter Martin, who's right down here in the front, on behalf of the Cosmic Future Institute with support from John Tuttle, Kevin Komisarut, Aaron James, and Patricia Wright. I also wanted to extend my personal thanks to the team at the Schwartz-Reisman Institute under the leadership of Marco Montero Silva, and also to U of T Director of Campus Events, Sarah Reed, who you saw directing traffic in the back with me. They really were critical to making this event occur. Leaving the best to last, our profound thanks to Professor Geoffrey Hinton for addressing us tonight. Jeff, thanks for sharing your frank insights and for your impactful and scholarly work these many years. And in closing, I hope you all learned something, and I hope you all go away feeling more passionate about some of these fascinating and really important problems that we have before us, and that you'll study here at the University of Toronto, the best place in the world to study AI, but AI from a multidisciplinary perspective, not just from the computer science department. So thank you and good night.